The dust was a shroud, clinging to everything, coating the rough-hewn boards of the buildings, the sparse, struggling vegetation, and the weary faces of the people in Redemption Gulch. For Alara, it felt like another layer of the veil that separated her from the world. She moved through the town like a wraith, her head bowed, the wide brim of her worn bonnet pulled low, a futile attempt to hide the truth that everyone here already knew. They knew the story, or at least the parts they had embellished for their own cruel entertainment. They knew the fire, the one that had taken her family and left its searing mark across half her face and down her left arm. They knew the scars, white and puckered against her skin, pulling at the corner of her eye, distorting the line of her mouth, rendering her a spectacle, a cautionary tale, a pariah. The whispers followed her, sharp as shards of glass. Children pointed, their mothers quickly pulling them away, murmuring warnings too low for her to hear clearly but loud enough to convey their meaning. Don't touch her. Don't look too long. She's touched by something unnatural. The men averted their gazes with a performative piety, or stared with a morbid, repulsive curiosity. No one spoke to her directly, not unless it was to demand payment for the meager supplies she needed: flour, beans, oil for her lamp, and even then, the transactions were curt, the coins snatched from her hand as if her touch might contaminate them. She lived in a small, crumbling cabin on the edge of town, inherited after the fire, a place no one else wanted. It was a lonely existence, marked by the rhythm of the sun and the constant, gnawing ache of solitude. Fear was her shadow, walking with her every step, fear of the judgment, fear of the future, fear of the past that had left her so broken. Each day was a battle against the despair that threatened to swallow her whole. She remembered the laughter, the warmth of her mother's embrace, the easy smile of her father before the flames had consumed their world. Now, only the ghost of heat remained, trapped in the painful tautness of her skin, a constant reminder of what she had lost and what she had become in the eyes of others. The air was thick with unspoken condemnation, a heavy weight pressing down on her lungs, making each breath a conscious effort. Survival was a grim task, devoid of joy, fueled only by a stubborn, desperate will to simply exist. She mended her own clothes, patched the cabin roof when it leaked, hauled water from the distant, often muddy creek. Hardship was a familiar companion, but the emotional isolation was the cruelest burden. She longed for a kind word, a gentle look, anything that acknowledged her humanity beneath the visible damage. But the town had rendered its verdict, and Redemption Gulch offered no redemption for the scarred woman. She was trapped in a cage of their making, the bars forged from fear and ignorance. The world outside the gulch felt impossibly distant, a place where perhaps people saw differently, but the thought of venturing into it alone, carrying her visible burden, was more terrifying than remaining in the confines of her known misery. The sun beat down mercilessly, bleaching the color from the land and perhaps, she sometimes feared, from her own spirit. The dust swirled around her ankles as she walked, a gritty, constant presence, mirroring the coarseness of her life. There was no softness here, no comfort, only the stark reality of her existence and the unwavering cruelty of human nature. The silence of her cabin at night was broken only by the wind whistling through the cracks in the walls and the frantic beating of her own heart, a lonely drum in the vast emptiness. She was a monument to tragedy, and the townspeople treated her as such, something to be observed from a safe distance, a reminder of the fragility of life and the arbitrary nature of misfortune, but never something to be touched or helped. Her hands, though calloused from work, often trembled, a residual effect of the trauma and the constant strain of living under such scrutiny. Sleep offered little respite, haunted by flickering images of fire and the cold, empty faces of those who now turned away. The weight of their collective gaze was a physical pressure, heavy and suffocating. She was an outcast, not by choice, but by circumstance and the unyielding judgment of a small, unforgiving community. The beauty people sought in others, the easy comeliness that smoothed paths and opened doors, had been stripped from her, leaving behind a landscape of ruin. And in the mirror, she saw not herself, but the monster the town had made her believe she was. Then, A stranger rode into Redemption Gulch. He was tall, lean, a figure etched against the harsh sunlight, his duster stirring the ever-present dust as his horse moved with a slow, measured gait. He dismounted in front of the saloon, his movements economical, deliberate. The townspeople stopped what little they were doing. Eyes watched him from doorways and windows. He wasn't like the drifters who occasionally passed through, looking for work or trouble. There was a stillness about him, a quiet authority that commanded attention without demanding it. He wore a gun belt, the holster well worn, the butt of a Colt visible, but he didn't look like a man seeking a fight. He looked like a man who knew how to handle one and preferred not to. His face was sharp, planed by sun and wind. His eyes a color Alara couldn't discern from her vantage point across the street, but they seemed steady, observant. He didn't swagger or boast. He tied his horse, checked the cinch, then walked into the saloon, the batwing doors swinging shut behind him, leaving the street feeling oddly empty despite the eyes still watching. Alara watched him too, hidden mostly by the shadow of an awning. She watched the way the town watched him, a mixture of suspicion and reluctant respect. He was an unknown variable in their predictable, isolated world. She wondered what brought him here, to a place that offered little but dust and judgment. Her gaze, usually fixed on the ground, lingered on the spot where he had stood. There was something about his self-possession that intrigued her, perhaps because it was so utterly alien to her own constant state of fear and vulnerability. Later, she saw him emerge from the saloon. He didn't linger. He walked slowly along the boardwalk, his hands loosely at his sides. He looked at the buildings, the dry goods store, the blacksmith, the empty church. He looked at the people he passed, his gaze meeting theirs without challenge, but also without deference. And then his eyes fell upon her. Alara froze, caught in the act of watching him. She expected the usual reaction, the quick aversion, the recoil, the veiled horror. But it didn't come. He simply looked at her. His gaze was steady, level. It wasn't pity. It wasn't revulsion. It was simply observation. He saw the scars. She knew he did. They were impossible to miss. But his expression didn't change. It held a certain weariness, perhaps, a depth she couldn't fathom, but nothing that betrayed judgment. He looked at her for a long moment, long enough for the silence between them to stretch and become taut. Alara felt a strange sensation, unfamiliar and unsettling. It wasn't the burning shame she was accustomed to, but something akin to being truly seen, without the usual filter of disgust. It was unnerving. She lowered her head quickly, pulling her bonnet forward, retreating back into the safety of anonymity, even though it was a safety born of invisibility. When she dared to look up again, he was walking on, his stride even unhurried. He hadn't smiled, hadn't offered a greeting, hadn't done anything remarkable. Yet his simple, non-judgmental gaze had disrupted the carefully constructed world of her isolation more profoundly than any shout or insult ever could. He was an outsider, like her, but unlike her, he carried himself with an air of belonging, even in a place where he clearly didn't. This man, this quiet gunslinger, represented an unknown. He hadn't fitted neatly into any of the categories she had assigned to the townspeople. He wasn't cruel, wasn't morbidly curious, wasn't piously avoidant. He was just there, observing, accepting the reality of what he saw without layering it with condemnation. It was a small thing, a mere look, but in the desert of her existence, even a single drop of non-judgment felt like a flood. The town's usual mechanisms of exclusion continued, but now Alara was acutely aware of the stranger's presence, a silent counterpoint to the usual symphony of scorn. She went to the general store for supplies. Mrs. Gable, the proprietor, a woman whose face was a roadmap of disapproval, served her with her customary cold efficiency, placing the items on the counter as if reluctant to touch Alara's outstretched hand. "That'll be $2.40, Mrs. Gable said, her voice tight, her eyes fixed somewhere over Alara's shoulder, anywhere but on her face. The price was inflated, as it always was for Alara. She knew it, but arguing was useless. She counted out the coins slowly, her scarred hand trembling slightly. As she did, the The saloon doors swung open, and the stranger stepped out onto the boardwalk, pausing as his eyes adjusted to the glare. He stood there for a moment, his gaze sweeping the street. Elara felt her breath catch in her throat as his eyes paused on the general store, on the tableau of her transaction with Mrs. Gable. He didn't stare overtly, didn't linger, but she felt the weight of his observation. He saw Mrs. Gable's averted gaze, the deliberate distance she kept, the air of distaste that surrounded the interaction. He saw Elara's bowed head, the careful way she avoided looking up, the visible tremor in her hand. He saw the dynamic, the silent play of power and vulnerability, rejection and quiet endurance. He didn't intervene, didn't offer a word. He simply saw. Elara finished paying, gathered her meager package, and hurried out of the store, avoiding his gaze as she passed him on the boardwalk. But as she walked away, she had the distinct feeling that his eyes followed her, not with curiosity or judgment, but with that same quiet, steady observation. It was unsettling, this feeling of being seen without being condemned. It chipped away at the protective shell of invisibility she had built around herself. Later that day, a group of boys, bolder than usual, perhaps spurred on by boredom or the cruelty of their elders, cornered Elara near the edge of town. They threw small stones, shouting insults. "Monster! Scarface! Go back where you came from!" Elara huddled against a fence, trying to shield her face with her arms, the familiar terror seizing her. She didn't cry out. She had learned that screaming only encouraged them. She just waited for it to be over, for them to tire of their sport. Suddenly, the stone-throwing stopped. The shouting faltered. Elara cautiously lowered her arms. The boys were looking past her, their faces turning from gleeful malice to apprehension. Standing a short distance away was the stranger. He hadn't drawn his gun. He hadn't said a word. He was just standing there, arms loosely crossed, watching them. His expression was unreadable, but his presence was a tangible force, heavy with a silent disapproval that seemed to cow the boys more effectively than any threat. They exchanged nervous glances, shuffled their feet, and then, muttering under their breath, they dispersed, scattering like frightened birds. The stranger remained where he was until the last of them had gone. He didn't approach Elara. He didn't speak. He simply held her gaze for a brief moment, that same steady, non-judgmental look, before he turned and walked away towards the center of town. Elara remained frozen against the fence, her heart hammering against her ribs, not entirely from fear now, but from a bewildered sense of protection. He hadn't helped her, not directly. He hadn't chased the boys away. But his mere presence, his willingness to witness the cruelty and stand as a silent, disapproving sentinel, had been enough. It was the first time in years anyone had offered her even this passive form of defense. It was bewildering, unsettlingly kind. He hadn't spoken, but his actions had spoken volumes. He had seen her at her most vulnerable, attacked and afraid, and he hadn't turned away in disgust or indifference. He had simply stood there, and in doing so, he had drawn an invisible line, a boundary the boys had instinctively understood not to cross. She didn't know his name, didn't know anything about him, but in that moment, the silent stranger had become a presence in her life, a mystery that offered a faint, almost imperceptible flicker of something she hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. It was a fragile thing, easily crushed, but it was there, nestled in the space left by the departing fear. The dust settled around her, but the air felt different, charged with the memory of his quiet intervention. Necessity, as it often does, proved a harsh architect of connection. A late-season storm rolled in, a violent tempest that ripped through Redemption Gulch with little warning. Wind howled like a banshee, tearing at loose boards and rattling window panes. Rain lashed down, turning the dry creek bed into a raging torrent and the town streets into muddy rivers. Elara's cabin, already in disrepair, groaned under the onslaught. The roof, poorly patched, began to leak heavily in several places. Water seeped under the door, turning the dirt floor to mud. The wind threatened to tear the frail structure apart. She huddled in the least leaky corner, wrapped in her thin blanket, shivering from the cold and the mounting fear that the cabin would collapse around her. Just as she contemplated trying to ride out the storm in the dubious shelter of the root cellar, there was a loud, insistent knocking on her door, almost lost in the roar of the wind. Alara froze, her heart leaping into her throat. No one ever came to her cabin. Not willingly. Cautiously, she approached the door, peering through a crack in the rough wood. Standing on her small porch, soaked and grim-faced, was the stranger. He held a lantern, its light flickering wildly in the wind. He didn't say anything, just looked at her through the crack, his eyes meeting hers. There was no judgment in his gaze, only a pragmatic assessment of the situation. The wind ripped at his clothes, plastering his hair to his forehead. Hesitantly, Alara unbarred the door and pulled it open. The wind and rain immediately surged inside. "Your roof won't hold," he stated, his voice low but clear above the storm's fury. It wasn't a question or an offer of help, just a simple statement of fact. Town hall, stone building, solid. Come. He didn't wait for her answer, simply turned and began to walk through the driving rain towards the center of town. Alara hesitated for only a moment. Staying here was folly, potentially deadly. Going with him, a stranger, was a terrifying prospect, but the alternative was worse. Clutching her blanket and the small satchel containing her few valuables, she stepped out into the storm, pulling the door shut behind her. The rain was blinding, the wind relentless. She struggled to keep her footing in the mud. The stranger glanced back, saw her difficulty, and without a word, fell into step beside her, not offering his arm, but simply walking closer, his presence a solid anchor against the wind's force. He didn't speak during the short, brutal walk to the town hall. He just navigated the treacherous ground, occasionally placing a hand on her back to steady her over a particularly bad patch. His touch brief and impersonal, purely functional. They reached the town hall, a sturdy, two-story building of stone, its dark shape a reassuring presence against the storm-racked sky. The stranger pushed open the heavy door, ushering her inside. The air was still, blessedly dry and calm compared to the maelstrom outside. Several other townspeople were already there, huddled near the fireplace, driven from their less sturdy homes by the storm. As Alara entered behind the stranger, a hush fell over the room. Heads turned, eyes widened. A collective gasp, quickly stifled, rippled through the small group. Alara shrank back, pulling her bonnet tighter, acutely aware of the sudden silence and the weight of their stares. She could feel their fear, their revulsion, palpable in the close air. But the stranger didn't seem to notice. He walked further into the room, nodded curtly to the town sheriff who sat by the fire, and found an empty corner away from the main group. He unrolled his bedroll, offered Alara a small, dry space beside it on the floor, and settled down, leaning against the wall. He didn't speak to her, didn't try to make conversation. He simply existed in the space beside her, his presence a quiet defiance of the town's collective shunning. The townspeople watched them, their faces a mixture of confusion and indignation. Why had he, the capable stranger, brought her, the scarred woman, into their safe haven? It was clear they felt she didn't belong, not even in a crisis. But they didn't dare voice their objections with the stranger present. He didn't carry the easy authority of the sheriff, but he carried the implicit authority of a man who was self-sufficient and unafraid, qualities that commanded respect in a place like this. Alara sat beside him, pulling her blanket around her shoulders. She was still trembling, but not just from the cold. It was the shock of being helped, of being included, however reluctantly by the townspeople, by this man who had every reason to avoid her as everyone else did. The silence stretched, filled only by the roar of the storm outside and the crackling of the fire. The stranger closed his eyes, feigning sleep, but Alara could sense his awareness, his quiet watchfulness. For the first time in years, she didn't feel utterly alone in a room full of people. She felt seen, protected, not by words or grand gestures, but by the simple fact of his presence beside her, a silent statement against the storm outside and the storm of judgment within the walls. They remained in the town hall for the duration of the storm. The forced proximity was uncomfortable for Alara, acutely aware of the townspeople's averted gazes and whispered comments. But the stranger, Kane, as she heard the sheriff address him, remained a constant, quiet presence beside her. He didn't interact with the other townsfolk, offering only brief, necessary responses if spoken to directly. His attention seemed reserved, withdrawn. When the storm finally abated the next morning, leaving behind a world washed clean but ravaged, the townspeople quickly dispersed, eager to assess the damage to their own property and return to the comfort of their homes. They left as quickly as possible, pointedly ignoring Alara. Kane packed up his bedroll with the same efficient movements Alara had observed before. He stood, stretched, and then, for the first time since bringing her here, he spoke directly to her, his voice low. "Your cabin," he said, "might be bad. It wasn't sympathy, just a practical observation." Alara nodded, her stomach tightening with dread. "I know," she whispered, her voice raspy from disuse. He looked at her face then, his gaze resting briefly on the scarred side before meeting her eyes. There was no pity, but there was a flicker of something she couldn't identify, recognition, perhaps, or a deep, weary understanding. "Come on," he said, turning towards the door. Again, it wasn't a question or an offer, but an assumption that she would follow. And she did. Her cabin was indeed bad. Part of the roof had collapsed, leaving a gaping hole open to the sky. Rainwater had flooded the interior, ruining the few possessions she had. Her small stove was overturned, her bedding soaked. It was devastation, stark and complete. Alara stood in the doorway, a wave of despair washing over her. This was it. She had nothing left. No home, no refuge. The isolation she had endured felt less oppressive now than the prospect of being utterly exposed, utterly without shelter. Tears welled in her eyes, silent and hot. She didn't make a sound, but the grief was a physical ache in her chest. Kane stood beside her, surveying the damage. He didn't offer platitudes. He didn't tell her it would be all right. He simply observed the destruction, his expression unreadable. Then he looked at her, saw the tears tracking through the dust on her cheeks, saw the utter hopelessness in her stance. And for a long moment, he simply stood there, bearing witness to her pain without flinching, without turning away. It was a simple act, but profoundly powerful. In a world that recoiled from her suffering as much as from her appearance, his quiet presence felt like a lifeline. He didn't try to fix her or the situation with words. He just saw her, in her moment of utter brokenness, and didn't abandon her. He walked into the ruined cabin, wading through the mud. He poked at the collapsed roof timbers with his boot. He looked at the soaked walls. He was assessing the damage, not with the detached air of a stranger, but with a pragmatic focus that suggested problem-solving. "Needs rebuilding," he said, stating the obvious with characteristic economy of words. Alara could only nod, unable to speak past the lump in her throat. Rebuilding felt like an impossible task. Where would she even begin? Who would help her? The townspeople would likely see this as God's judgment, a fitting end for the scarred woman. She braced herself for him to leave, now that he had seen the full extent of her misfortune. But he didn't. He stayed, his gaze scanning the surrounding area as if calculating resources. The silence stretched again, not empty this time, but filled with the unspoken question of what would happen next. Kane didn't leave. Not that day, nor the next. He didn't explain why he stayed, and Alara didn't ask. He simply began, in his quiet, methodical way, to help her. He found salvageable timbers amongst the wreckage of the roof. He walked out into the sparsely wooded hills surrounding the gulch and returned with lengths of fallen branches sturdy enough for repair work. He didn't work tirelessly or performatively. He worked with a steady, efficient rhythm, breaking only for water or a sparse meal of hardtack and jerky. Alara, initially stunned into inaction by despair, slowly began to help him. She cleared away debris, sorted through her few salvageable belongings, and, hesitantly at first, worked alongside him, lifting, carrying, and clearing. They didn't talk much. Their communication was limited to brief instructions. Hold this. Hand me that. Careful. And the shared sounds of labor, the scrape of wood, the thud of hammers, their own breathing. Yet, in the shared silence, a different kind of communication began to unfold. Alara watched him. She saw the strength in his hands, the focused intensity in his eyes when he was measuring or fitting timbers. She saw the way he moved, with a quiet confidence that bordered on grace despite the heavy work. She saw that he never once looked at her scars with anything other than perhaps a passing glance, acknowledging their existence without dwelling on them, treating them as simply another feature of her, like the color of her eyes or the dust on her clothes. This unwavering acceptance, shown through his actions rather than any verbal declaration, was more healing than any salve she had ever applied to her skin. It allowed her to look at him, truly look, without the usual self-consciousness. She saw the lines etched around his eyes, the slight tension around his mouth even in repose, hinting at his own history, his own burdens, unseen but perhaps as deeply carved as her own. He was an enigma, but his actions were clear. He was helping her, the outcast, the woman everyone else avoided. It was an act of profound, unassuming kindness. One evening, as they sat by a small fire outside the partially repaired cabin, sharing a meager meal, Alara found herself speaking. It wasn't planned. The words simply came, hesitant at first, then with a slow, steady flow, like water finding its course. She told him about the fire, about her family, about the sheer terror of the heat, the smoke, the feeling of being trapped. She spoke of the pain, the long, agonizing recovery, the first time she saw her reflection and didn't recognize the stranger staring back. She spoke of coming to Redemption Gulch, hoping for a new start, and finding only a different kind of confinement. She spoke of the isolation, the fear, the crushing weight of loneliness. She didn't look at him as she spoke, her gaze fixed on the flickering flames. She expected pity, or worse, the sudden awkwardness of someone who didn't know how to respond to such raw vulnerability. But Cain didn't interrupt. He didn't offer platitudes or words of comfort. He simply listened. Alara could feel his presence beside her, solid and still. When she finally fell silent, the only sound was the crackling fire and the distant howl of a coyote. The silence stretched, not awkward, but contemplative. After a long moment, Cain finally spoke, his voice low, quiet. "Scars tell a story," he said. It wasn't a question or a judgment, but a simple statement of fact. "They show you survived." Alara looked up, met his eyes across the firelight. His gaze was steady, understanding. He wasn't just looking at her scars. He was looking at the story they told, a story of survival against overwhelming odds. He didn't see ruin, he saw resilience. In that moment, something shifted within Alara. For the first time, she didn't feel defined by the scars, but saw them as markers of her journey, a testament to her strength. Cain's words, his simple acceptance, had given her a new perspective. He hadn't tried to erase her past or diminish her pain, but he had reframed the physical manifestations of that past into something that spoke not of brokenness, but of enduring strength. It was a profound gift. He shared little of his own past, offering only vague references to a life lived on the move, to places left behind, to necessary hardships. But Alara sensed a deep reservoir of pain within him too, carefully guarded, managed with that same quiet stoicism he applied to everything. They were two wounded souls, finding a strange, unexpected solace in each other's company, bound not by shared history, but by shared understanding of what it meant to carry invisible and visible burdens in a world that often had little patience for either. The fire cast dancing shadows across their faces, softening the harsh lines, creating a small island of warmth and acceptance in the vast, indifferent landscape. As the cabin became slowly habitable again, thanks to their combined efforts, the dynamic between Alara and Cain shifted subtly. The necessity of their shared labor had forged a bond, quiet but strong. They moved around each other with ease, a comfortable familiarity settling between them. Alara found herself anticipating his needs, handing him tools before he asked, having water ready when he paused. Cain, in turn, seemed to anticipate hers, ensuring she had the warmer blanket at night, leaving the best portions of their meager food for her. It was a silent partnership, built on mutual respect and a shared sense of being outside the conventional world. The townspeople watched from a distance, their disapproval palpable. The scarred woman and the quiet stranger. It was a combination they couldn't comprehend, couldn't tolerate. Whispers turned into bolder pronouncements. Preacher Silas, a man whose piety was often overshadowed by his self-righteousness, took to preaching sermons about sin, finding company, and the dangers of consorting with those marked by misfortune. Mrs. Gable refused to sell Alara goods again, citing a sudden shortage, her eyes flicking towards Cain standing silently behind Alara on the boardwalk. Other doors were closed to her. They were trying to force Cain away, to force Alara back into utter isolation, to starve her out, figuratively and perhaps literally. One evening, as they were finishing the final repairs on the cabin roof, a group of men from the town, emboldened by whiskey and the preacher's words, approached the cabin. Led by Jed, a burly ranch hand known for his cruelty, they stopped a short distance away, shouting insults and threats. "Hey, Scarface, got yourself a protector now, eh?" Jed sneered, spitting in the dust. "Thought no man take a look at that melted face of yours." Another man laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. "Better watch out, stranger. She might burn you too." Alara tensed, fear tightening her chest. She hadn't faced a confrontation like this since Cain arrived. She instinctively moved closer to him. Cain stepped forward slightly, placing himself between Alara and the men. His posture wasn't aggressive, but it was alert, ready. His hand hung loosely at his side, near the butt of his Colt. He didn't speak, his silence a challenge. Jed took another step forward, emboldened by the lack of verbal response. "What's wrong, quiet man? Cat got your tongue? Or you just ashamed to be seen with that thing?" He gestured crudely towards Alara. Cain's eyes, usually steady, hardened. Still, he didn't speak. His gaze was fixed on Jed, unwavering, assessing. The air crackled with tension. The other men shifted nervously. Jed, fueled by bravado, reached out a hand as if to shove Cain. It was a mistake. In a movement too fast for Alara to follow, Cain's hand blurred. There was the swift, metallic sound of a gun clearing leather. Cain didn't point it at Jed, not directly. He aimed at the ground just inches from Jed's boot and squeezed the trigger. The shot was deafening in the sudden silence, kicking up a puff of dust and forcing Jed to yelp and stumble back, clutching his ringing ear. Cain's gun was back in its holster before the echo of the shot faded. He hadn't moved from his spot. He hadn't raised his voice. He simply stood there, gun holstered, his gaze cold and dangerous. "Get out," he said, his voice low, utterly devoid of emotion, yet carrying more weight than any roar. Jed, his face pale beneath the dirt, looked from Cain's impassive face to the small hole in the ground near his boot. He recognized the quiet deadliness in the stranger. Without another word, Jed turned and scrambled away, his companions following close behind, their bravado evaporating like mist in the sun. Cain watched them go, his body remaining tense until they were out of sight. Alara stared, adrenaline coursing through her. She had seen him handle a gun, but never like this. It wasn't violence for its own sake. It was a precise, contained warning, delivered with chilling efficiency. He had defended her, not just with his presence, but with decisive action. He turned then, looking back at Alara. The hard edge in his eyes softened slightly as he met her gaze. "They won't bother you again," he said, his voice returning to its normal quiet tone. Alara could only nod, too overwhelmed to speak. She felt a surge of gratitude so strong it brought tears to her eyes. But more than gratitude, she felt a profound sense of safety. This man, the quiet, scarred stranger, had faced down the town's cruelty on her behalf. He hadn't judged her, and he had protected her from those who did. In his eyes, she saw not her scars, but simply her. It was a liberation. The confrontation with Jed and the men had a ripple effect in Redemption Gulch. While their fear of Cain prevented direct harassment, the town's hostility towards Alara solidified into a cold, hard wall of avoidance. No one spoke to her, not even with whispers. The stores remained closed to her. The well pump seemed to freeze when she approached. They were using every passive means at their disposal to make it clear she was unwelcome, hoping to force her to leave, and perhaps take the dangerous stranger with her. But Alara didn't leave. Cain didn't leave. They stayed in the small, repaired cabin on the edge of town, a defiant presence against the backdrop of the town's silent condemnation. Their partnership deepened, settling into a quiet rhythm of coexistence. They shared chores, shared meals, shared the vast silence of the landscape. Alara learned to read the subtle shifts in Cain's mood, the slight tensing of his shoulders, the way his eyes narrowed when he was thinking or wary. He, in turn, seemed to understand her unspoken needs, her moments of fear or quiet sadness. One evening, sitting by the fire, Alara traced the lines of her scars with her fingertips. The tautness was still there, a constant physical reminder, but the emotional weight had lessened. She looked at Cain, who was mending a tear in his saddlebag. "Do they bother you?" she asked, her voice soft, barely audible. Cain paused his work, looked up, and met her gaze. His expression was calm, steady. "No," he said simply. He returned to his saddlebag, then added, "They're part of you, like the sun on your hair or the dust on your boots." It was such an ordinary comparison, placing her scars on the same level as sunlight and dirt, that it was revolutionary. He didn't see them as a disfigurement, a mark of shame or horror. He saw them as simply part of the whole. Alara felt a warmth spread through her chest, easing the long-held ache. His acceptance wasn't pity or a strained effort. It was genuine, effortless. For the first time, she felt a glimmer of self-acceptance, a sense that perhaps she wasn't irreparably broken, but simply different. And different wasn't necessarily bad. Cain had shown her that difference could be borne with quiet dignity, could even be a source of strength. He didn't preach or instruct. He simply lived his life, unapologetically an outsider, relying on his own capabilities, unaffected by the world's judgment. And in witnessing this, Alara began to internalize that resilience. Her fear of the town's gaze lessened. Their disapproval still stung, but it no longer held the power to paralyze her. She began to walk with her head held a little higher, her bonnet not pulled quite so low. The scars were still visible, but they were no longer the only thing people saw, or rather, no longer the only thing she felt. She started tending a small patch of land near the cabin, coaxing reluctant vegetables from the dry soil. It was hard work, but it was life-affirming, a small act of creation in a world that had seemed determined to see only destruction in her. Cain watched her, sometimes offering a hand with the heavier work, sometimes just observing from a distance as she knelt in the dirt. There was a quiet approval in his gaze, a recognition of her burgeoning strength. They were two lone figures against the vastness of the landscape, bound by mutual understanding, by a shared resilience forged in hardship. The world outside their small haven was still harsh, the town still unwelcoming, but within the walls of the mended cabin, a different kind of world was taking shape, one built on quiet acceptance, unspoken trust, and the shared understanding that true beauty was not found in the absence of scars, but in the strength of the soul that carried them. The fragile peace they had found was inevitably threatened. The town's resentment, simmering beneath the surface, needed an outlet. It came in the form of Elias Finch, a slick, opportunistic businessman who arrived in Redemption Gulch with plans to buy up land, including Alara's small plot, which sat near a potential water source he wanted to control. Finch saw Alara's isolation and the town's hostility as an opportunity. He believed she would be easy to intimidate, easy to push out. He underestimated her newfound resilience and the quiet strength of the man by her side. Finch, accompanied by the sheriff, who was clearly beholden to him, and a couple of his hired hands, approached Alara's cabin one afternoon. Finch was all false smiles and condescending charm. "Mrs. Alara," he began, stumbling over her name, clearly seeing her as beneath notice. Lovely little spot you have here, though in need of some improvements, naturally. I'm prepared to make you a generous offer for this land. He named a pittance, an insultingly low figure. Alara stood on the porch, Cain standing just behind her, silent and watchful. The fear was there, a faint tremor beneath her skin, but it no longer controlled her. She looked at Finch, at the sheriff whose gaze refused to meet hers, at the hired hands whose expressions ranged from bored indifference to thinly veiled threat. She remembered their cruelty, their judgment, their willingness to see her homeless. "It's not for sale," Alara said, her voice quiet but steady. Finch's smile faltered. Now, no need to be difficult," he said, his tone hardening. "This is a fair offer. More than fair," considering. His eyes flicked dismissively over her face, landing on her scars. "Considering its current condition," Alara felt a surge of anger, hot and unfamiliar. "Its condition is my life," she said, her voice gaining strength. "And it is not for sale." Finch's face darkened. "Perhaps you don't understand," he said, stepping closer, his voice dropping, laced with menace. "It would be a shame if something unfortunate were to happen to your property. Or to you." The sheriff shuffled his feet, looking uncomfortable but doing nothing. Cain stepped forward then, coming to stand shoulder to shoulder with Alara. He didn't say a word, but his presence was a powerful deterrent. His gaze was fixed on Finch, unwavering and dangerous. Finch faltered for a moment, recognizing the look in Cain's eyes. He had dealt with hired muscle before, but there was something different about this man, something coiled and deadly. But Finch was arrogant, used to getting his way through intimidation and wealth. "And who is this?" he demanded, waving a hand at Cain. "Another squatter? Get him out of here, sheriff." The sheriff hesitated, looking from Finch to Cain's impassive, deadly face. "He ain't causing no trouble, Finch," the sheriff mumbled, clearly unwilling to confront Cain. Finch sneered. "He's associating with her. That's trouble enough." He turned his attention back to Alara. "Last chance. Take the offer, or things will become very difficult for you." Alara met his gaze, her chin lifted. She looked at Cain beside her, saw the silent, unwavering support in his stance. She felt the strength she had found within herself, nurtured by his acceptance. "No," she said, her voice clear and firm. "This is my home. I will not sell." Finch glared, his face red with frustrated rage. "You'll regret this," he snarled. "You have nowhere else to go. The town won't help you." Alara's gaze swept past Finch to the distant buildings of Redemption Gulch, the place that had scorned and rejected her. "I don't need their help," she said, her voice ringing with quiet defiance. "I have what I need right here." She met Finch's furious gaze, then glanced at Cain, a look of quiet partnership passing between them. Finch, defeated for the moment, spun on his heel. "Fine," he spat. "Have it your way. But don't say I didn't warn you." He stalked away, his hired hands following, the sheriff trailing awkwardly behind. Alara watched them go, her heart still pounding, but filled with a sense of triumph she had never known before. She had stood her ground, faced down the threat, and not surrendered. She turned to Cain, a shaky smile on her face. He offered a rare, small nod of approval. In that moment, she knew they had faced the worst the town could throw at them, and they had faced it together. The scars were still there, a part of her story, but they no longer dictated her fate. She had found her voice, her strength, and a quiet, powerful alliance that allowed her to stand tall against a world that had tried to keep her small and afraid. The days following Finch's visit were tense. Alara and Cain knew the threat wasn't gone, merely delayed. They took precautions, reinforcing the cabin, watching the roads leading into and out of town. The townspeople, aware of Finch's intentions and the confrontation at the cabin, remained distant, wary of getting involved, but their hostility towards Alara seemed to have shifted slightly. Some watched her with grudging respect, others with continued disapproval, but the outright scorn was less pervasive, replaced by a cautious curiosity about the woman who had defied Elias Finch and the quiet man who stood with her. Alara continued her work on the small garden, the act of nurturing life from the earth a grounding force. She felt a deep connection to the land, stubborn and resilient, much like herself. Cain spent hours patrolling the perimeter, scouting the surrounding hills, his senses sharp, his vigilance a constant, reassuring presence. They didn't speak of the potential danger constantly looming, but the unspoken understanding between them was profound. It was in the way Cain checked the load in his rifle before heading out, the way Alara made sure he had food and water, the way they both scanned the horizon whenever they were outside. One afternoon, as the sun began to dip towards the horizon, casting long shadows, the expected threat arrived. Not Finch himself, but a group of his hired enforcers, rough-looking men Alara had never seen in the gulch before, led by a cold-eyed individual named Thorn. They approached the cabin, not bothering with pleasantries, their intentions clear. They were here to remove Alara by force, perhaps torch the cabin to make sure she didn't return. Alara and Cain were ready. They had prepared. The cabin door was barred from the inside. Cain was positioned near the single window, rifle in hand. Alara stood by the door, armed with a heavy iron poker, her heart pounding but her resolve set. This was their home, their sanctuary, and they would defend it. Thorn hammered on the door. "Open up. Finch wants this land. You're leaving, one way or another." His voice was rough, menacing. Alara didn't respond. Cain remained silent at the window, his gaze fixed on the approaching men. Thorn cursed, and the men began to try and force the door open. Wood splintered, groaning under the assault. Just as the door threatened to buckle, Cain fired his rifle. Not at the men, but at the ground in front of them, the shot echoing sharply. The men froze, startled. Thorn recovered quickly. "Inside, huh? Think that flimsy wood will stop us?" he snarled. "Barning ouchi." One of the men produced a torch, running towards the cabin wall. As he raised it, Cain fired again. This time, the shot was more precise. The man cried out, dropping the torch, clutching his arm where a bullet had grazed him. He stumbled back. "He's armed and ready," one of the other men yelled nervously. Thorn glared at the cabin. He knew Cain was a skilled shot, but he had numbers on his side. "Rush the door," he ordered. As the men charged, Alara acted. She had anticipated this. Using the heavy poker, she swung it against the window frame, shattering the glass. Reaching through, she quickly doused a length of sacking with kerosene she had kept ready, lit it with a match, and hurled it out the window towards the charging men. The flaming bundle landed amongst them, forcing them to scatter, some yelping as sparks or flames caught their clothes. It wasn't much, but it bought them precious seconds. Cain used the distraction, firing 2 rapid shots that struck the door frame, sending splinters flying and making the attackers hesitate further. The men were faltering, unnerved by the combination of Cain's deadly accuracy and Alara's unexpected, fiery defense. Thorn cursed, realizing this wasn't going to be the easy job he'd expected. He looked towards the town, perhaps hoping for help, but the streets remained empty. No one in Redemption Gulch was coming to help Elias Finch's thugs attack the scarred woman and the quiet gunslinger. The standoff continued for a tense few minutes, punctuated by Cain's strategically placed shots and the nervous shuffling of Finch's men. Thorn assessed the situation. 2 men injured or stunned, their momentum lost, facing an opponent they couldn't see, who clearly knew how to handle a gun, and unexpectedly backed by the woman they had underestimated. He made his decision. "Fall back," he roared, clearly frustrated. "It ain't worth it. Finch can find another way." The men didn't hesitate, gathering their injured companion and retreating back the way they came, disappearing into the gathering dusk. Alara and Cain remained vigilant until long after the sounds of their retreat had faded. The air was thick with the smell of kerosene and gunpowder. The cabin bore the marks of the attack, splintered wood, a broken window, a lingering tension in the air. But they had held their ground. They had faced the physical manifestation of the town's and Finch's cruelty and prevailed, not through passive endurance, but through active, united defense. Alara looked at Cain, her face streaked with dirt and soot, her heart still racing. He looked back, his expression calm, a flicker of respect in his eyes. In that moment, standing amidst the remnants of the attack, their partnership felt not just like survival, but like a victory, hard-won and deeply meaningful. The sun rose on Redemption Gulch, illuminating the dust and the silent aftermath of the night's confrontation. Finch's men were gone, retreating from the quiet defiance they had encountered. The townspeople, though they hadn't intervened, had witnessed the failure of Finch's attempt to dislodge Alara. Whispers still existed, but the tone had shifted. The scarred woman who had always been a symbol of vulnerability and misfortune had shown unexpected strength. The quiet stranger who had stood by her side was no longer just an enigma, but a force to be reckoned with, bound to her by an unseen tie. Alara and Cain surveyed the damage to the cabin. It was reparable. More than that, it was theirs. They set about patching the window, reinforcing the door. Their movements were efficient, synchronized, the product of a partnership forged in shared hardship and mutual respect. As they worked, Alara felt a profound sense of peace settle over her. The fear that had been her constant companion for so long had receded, replaced by a quiet confidence. She was still scarred, yes. The physical marks remained, a part of her story, but they no longer defined her. She was Alara, a woman who had survived fire, survived rejection, survived fear, and found strength in herself and in the unexpected bond with another soul. Cain finished hammering the last nail into the repaired doorframe. He wiped his brow, looking out at the vast, indifferent landscape. He wasn't a man for long speeches or grand declarations. His acceptance of her, his protection, had been shown through action, not words. Alara stood beside him, her gaze following his. The future was uncertain. Finch might try again. The world outside their small haven remained harsh and unforgiving. But she no longer faced it alone. She looked at the scars on her hand, tracing their familiar pattern. They were no longer symbols of shame, but badges of resilience. Cain had seen past the surface, seen the person beneath, and in his steady gaze, she had finally seen herself, not as a victim, but as a survivor. The beauty the town had refused to see wasn't in the absence of the scars, but in the strength that bloomed despite them, the spirit that refused to be extinguished. Redemption Gulch might never fully accept her, but their acceptance no longer held the power it once did. Her redemption wasn't in their eyes, but in her own heart, in the quiet strength she had discovered, and in the silent, unwavering partnership she had found with the lone gunslinger who had seen the woman beneath the scars. They stood together, two figures against the wide sky, bound by a bond forged in the crucible of hardship and acceptance. The journey was far from over, the path ahead uncertain, but they would walk it together, side by side, facing whatever came with a quiet strength that had been born from the ashes of the past and nurtured in the barren soil of Redemption Gulch. It was not the fairy tale ending of a world magically healed, but a truer, harder-won hope, the understanding that even in the harshest places, amidst the deepest pain and rejection, finding one true connection, one soul that sees you without judgment, can be the most beautiful and redemptive force of all. And in that quiet truth, Alara found not just survival, but a deep, abiding sense of peace and belonging she had never thought possible. The scars remained, but they were no longer a barrier, only a reminder of the fire she had walked through to emerge stronger, scarred but unbroken, finally free.